Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of the Layout Build series. Today's video is all about wiring and finally getting some trains running on the layout. Also, just a heads up, I will be uploading in 2 days from now, and that video will be all about the river scene that I've been working on, so do keep an eye out for that. And lastly, I do count up all the votes that we got on the previous episode on what should go here on these 2 tracks, so that will be towards the end of the video. So leaving off from last episode, all that was left was adding one final piece of track to complete the loop, which is what I'm doing here. I am also listening to the Model Rail Replacement podcast. It's a pretty awesome podcast about model trains, so it is perfect to listen to while I work on the layout. Once that piece of track is in, we do give it a good test with a tank car to make sure it's all smooth. Now to begin our wiring journey for the layout. This is pretty much all the supplies I will need to get the job done. I'll be using 14 gauge solid copper wire for my bus and 18 gauge solid copper wire for my feeders. To connect my feeders to my bus, I will be using these 3M Scotch Lock suitcase connectors, which are quite popular. To connect the wiring between each section, I'll be using these Anderson power pole connectors. And this bag here is just some screws and some cable holders that I saved from my previous layout. And of course, to get this done, I will need these tools. As with all my previous layouts, I will be using the same DCC system, which is the NCE Powercab. Here is one of the 2 diagrams to help you if you have never done this before. This diagram here represents the simplest setup for a smaller layout or a program track. Mine will be a little bit different, but the concept is very similar. The first step is to remove any and all things off the tracks. All but one thing. Next up, I decided to get my power panel installed into the layout, which will require some cutting and drilling. This tiny little piece here is where you connect the bus wires to, aka your track power. Once you put the wires in there, you do screw them down to secure them, and then you can plug it into your power panel. If you are using the Powercab alone, you need to just use the flat cable, not the curly one. The other side plugs into the controller, and we do also have our power plug. That gets plugged into here, and that's pretty much all the basics. I'll be placing the panel in the middle of the layout. I mark it with a Sharpie just to know how much is needed to cut out. Since I do not have a special tool to do this, I will just be drilling out most of it, then picking at it with some needle nose pliers. After cleaning it up, we do have a somewhat rough looking rectangle, but once the panel is in, you would never know that it wasn't perfect behind it. Next up, I decided to get all the feeder wires done. For this particular roll of wire, once you do remove that brown outer shell, you get 2 18 gauge wires, one in red and one in white. After lots of cutting, I now have a bunch of feeder wires ready to go. I do make sure that they're all a decent length because you can always cut them shorter if needed, but not the other way around. Then I strip one end of both wires. And then they get bent at a 90-degree angle so they can be soldered to the side of the rails. Holes are now drilled between the railroad ties so the feeders can reach the bottom. I repeat the process and I place a set of feeders on each track. For the best results when it comes to power, you do want the feeder wires to be every few feet of track. Now it's time to solder all these to the rails. This part can be stressful, but the more you do it, the better you'll get. You can see here I do end up messing up the ties, but those can be replaced. After a while, we have the yard completely done. Now it's time to set up the bus wires, which carries the power throughout the layout. Each end will have these connectors, which is perfect for modular layouts. To get those on the end of the 14 gauge wire, we must solder on these little silver pieces. The goal is to have the solder flow inside the silver piece for a solid connection. The bus wires will obviously be as long as each section. NCE recommends twisting the wires 3 times per foot to reduce voltage spikes. I now snap on the plastic shell onto the silver piece that we just soldered on, and you should hear a click. The first section of bus wires is now under the layout. All that's left is to connect all those dangling feeders to the bus. That is when these come in handy. This little guy here lets you connect the 2 wires without any soldering. I'll be demonstrating how it's done on this example piece of bus wire that I had left over. So the suitcase connector goes on, and then the feeder wire goes in on the other side. Then with pliers you squeeze the metal piece down, which cuts into each wire for a solid connection. That exact process is done until all feeders are connected to the bus, making sure red goes to red and white goes to white. The blue suitcase connectors that you see there aren't any special ones, I just had to use those because I ran out of the red ones. I do also set up my power supply, which will connect to an extension cable. And that's pretty much it. Eventually I will buy an SB5 power booster for more amps and walk around capability, but for now, this will do. Wiring is all done finally, and at this point, it has been 1 week since my last upload, so that does mean that it's time to count all the votes on what will be on the layout. The tank car industry got a total of 61 votes, and the diesel maintenance facility got 67 votes. It was very close, but we have an obvious winner. So that's what will be going here. And I was totally fine with either option, but I think this one will be pretty cool because, hey, who does not like a diesel maintenance facility? So I do want to thank you if you left a vote, and I'll probably be doing this again sometime in the future. Well, now it's time to test out all our hard work and run some trains on the layout. If you do have any questions on wiring, do let me know in the comments. And also a reminder, the new episode will be out in 2 days, and that's all about scenery, which is obviously much more exciting. Thank you for watching, and I will see you very soon in the next episode.